In this video, I'll provide a brief overview of the structure and function of your blood vessels. Remember that your cardiovascular system has three main parts. There is your heart, whose job is to pump the blood around the body, and then the blood vessels, the focus of this particular video, which are in charge of transporting blood all around the body. Blood vessels are designed to touch nearly every cell so that nutrients and important gases like oxygen can be exchanged. Blood vessels also come in different sizes. We have the largest arteries and veins, then in the middle-sized arterioles and venules, and finally the small capillaries. The third section of the cardiovascular system is the blood, which carries the important gases and nutrients, and that will have its own video. So blood vessels themselves are considered an organ in the cardiovascular system, and they form what is known as a closed circuit. We have a closed circulation in our bodies because one blood vessel leads to another, eventually to the heart, but everything is connected. Blood cannot leak out. Arteries and arterioles carry the blood from the heart. The capillaries, the smallest blood vessels, are where actually all the action happens. This is where the nutrients move into cells and waste move out of cells. And then the blood that has been deoxygenated and filled with waste products are carried back to the heart by first venules and then veins. This illustration on the right gives you some idea about how it's put together on a greatly condensed scale. We have some large arteries here coming into smaller arterioles that then can separate out into many, many small capillaries. As the blood moves through this network of capillaries known as the capillary bed, you can see how the color changes from pink, representing oxygenated blood, to a bluer color representing deoxygenated blood as oxygen is dropped off and carbon dioxide is picked up. And then from these smallest capillaries on the venous side, they flow into venules and then eventually into large veins. In the arterioles, you have smooth muscle cells that serve as gates, as sphincters, circular muscles that can close off part of the capillary bed. You see a sphincter being indicated here to shut down when blood doesn't really need to go to a particular part of the body because of inactivity of the muscles or organs in that section. So let's look a little bit closer at your arteries and arterioles. Their job is just to transport blood. They are not doing any kind of gas or nutrient exchange. Arteries are very thick walls that are strong because they have layers of both elastic tissue and smooth muscle tissue. There are actually three layers. You have a thick outer layer of collagen to keep things, tough, because collagen is a very tough protein. And then the inner layer made of these smooth muscles and elastin, because the arteries are going to have to stretch every time the heartbeat sends a pulse of blood through them. And then finally, the endothelium, the inner layer, that at the capillary level, that is all that is left. We've lost all the outer layers. So things get thinner as it moves from an artery to an arteriole to a capillary. Your arteries carry blood under high pressure because they are the recipients of that wave of blood that gets pumped out of the heart. And because of that, they expand and contract with each heartbeat. This is why you can feel a pulse at certain parts of your body, because your arteries are expanding under that wave of blood. From the arteries, blood moves into arterioles, which again are smaller and have thinner walls. They are not under such high pressure, and so they are more involved in directing the blood into a capillary, and sometimes, as I said, with the sphincter muscles allowing blood through or not allowing it through. This diagram shows the major arteries in the body, and you will notice that most of the names have something to do with the region that the artery is passing through, or the region or organ that is being supplied with blood because of that artery. Of course, you know about the aorta coming out of the heart, and it makes a curve in order to descend down the inside of the vertebral column. So we actually call that the aortic arch, and that's the largest artery in the body. But as it divides into different regions, you get things like subclavian, that's moving under, sub being under your clavicle, under the collarbone. We have the brachial arteries, both one that's closer to the surface and one that is down deep in the tissue, running through the upper arm. or you have the femoral artery that is down by the femoral region, your femur and the thigh area. You can also notice, as I said, going to certain organs, such as your kidneys, the renal artery. Renal refers to kidney, or celiac is referring to your stomach. And so these names of arteries often are corresponding with regions of the body, and that's the label that they are being given. In the brain, many people have a sort of a redundancy to allow blood flow to get to all parts of the brain, and it's known as the circle of Willis. And if you see here, the arteries coming in, the major arteries coming into the brain, have an option of sort of going around a traffic circle with various places to go off. What this allows to happen is if there's an injury to one part of this blood vessel network or to one part of the brain, and say it shuts down part of the brain over here, then the blood can still flow the other way and get to nourish the tissues that normally would be nourished from that side. So it's just because the brain is such an important organ and really needs that blood supply, this redundancy is built into the network of arteries to be able to ensure that if there has been damage, there's a greater chance that the brain tissue can still get the needed nutrients and important oxygen. Moving on to veins and venules. Veins have thinner walls than arteries because they're not carrying things under high pressure. Blood is pretty much low pressure by the time it gets to a vein. It's been pushed out by the blood, but it's spread out and covered through all the capillary beds and just sort of dribbles and collects back into the veins. Because it is low pressure, the challenge is to keep the blood moving through the veins. And one of the things that many veins have, especially the large veins in your legs and arms, are flap-like tissue valves that stop the blood from backflowing. So you have a little diagram down here showing how a valve will sit in the vein. Blood can flow through it this way, but if it tries to go backwards, like you saw with the semilunar valves in the heart, these little bits of tissue will sort of cup up and close off. Veins also serve as blood reservoirs, a storage place for excess blood. So not all of your blood is circulating every single second. Sometimes there are sections where blood is just kind of being held in reserve. Venules then are going down in size, will be smaller than veins, again, even thinner walls than the veins, and they have less smooth muscle tissue than arterioles because they, again, are not having to resist the contraction of that pulsive wave of blood coming through. Venule's job is to carry blood from the capillaries to the veins, and then eventually it'll be heading back to the heart. Just as we saw with the diagram of arteries, the diagram of veins shows you that many of the names of veins pertain to the region of the body that it is passing through. We've already talked about the two veins that enter the heart, the superior vena cava draining the body above the heart, the head and the arms, and then the inferior vena cava bringing the blood back to the heart from the rest of the body. But you can again see some very familiar words. We've got the brachial vein, we've got a facial vein, various parts of the body, femoral vein. So pretty much wherever the arteries are flowing, there'll be a vein in roughly the same spot. The venules, like the arterioles, will be less deep, more superficial, but again, it's at the capillary level that everything happens. If you've ever given blood, probably the blood has been taken from the cubital vein over here in your the crook of your elbow, though sometimes some of the other veins are used as well. Here's some microscope slides just showing you these tissues. We have an artery in this top picture here, and you can see how curled it is here, representing that this is an elastic tube that can expand out in all directions when blood comes through it, but this is in the relaxed state, and so that inner wall, the inner endothelium, has kind of collapsed and wrinkled up on itself. So these arteries are expanding and contracting as the pulses of blood go through. In the diagram over here on the right, you get a sense of the thickness of the walls, how it can change. Here we have an artery, and you can see that wall is very thick, because of the layers of smooth muscle and elastin, whereas the vein walls are much, much, much thinner because they don't have those thick walls to protect the blood vessel from rupturing when it is expanding and contracting due to the high pressure system. And then we have a picture of capillaries showing that the capillary really is only big enough for one blood cell. You look, here's the size of a blood cell, and here's your walls of the capillaries. And so you can see they're kind of squeezing through there. This allows a lot of contact between that wall of the capillary and the wall of the blood cell, which makes it easier for nutrients and gas exchange to happen back and forth right across those cell membranes because they are pretty much touching. So capillaries, as I said, are our smallest blood vessels, and they touch nearly every cell because they are about one red blood cell wide. The capillaries connect the smallest arteriole to the smallest venules, and they're permeable to various degrees. There actually are holes in the walls of the capillary so that various substances do not have to transfer through the cell membranes of the wall of the capillary, but it can be dumped into the interstitial fluid that, of course, is all around these body cells, and that allows it to move into the body cells themselves a little bit faster. So plasma, the fluid base of blood, can slide out through these slits, and certain macromolecules that are small enough can also move out and be more readily taken up by body cells. Here is a picture of capillaries in the skin, just showing how many those are. So basically, within all these little holes here are going to be your skin cells. So the capillaries are surrounding those skin cells so they can supply the cells with the nutrients they need. And this other picture is just showing that basically if you dissect away, or in this case, dissolve away the rest of the body, the capillaries, and leave the capillaries pretty much are giving you the shape of, in this case, a rabbit, just proving that those capillaries are touching all the cells of all the parts of that body. Now I want to talk a tiny bit about blood pressure. Blood pressure is the force exerted on the walls of your blood vessels. And again, it's because the heart is pumping out a wave of blood every time it contracts. The blood pressure in your arteries is the highest, and it will rise when the ventricles contract to give us a systolic pressure. And then as the ventricles relax, the arterial pressure also falls, and that's known as the diastolic pressure. And when someone's given their blood pressure taken, they are given two numbers. And the first number, or the number on top, is the systolic pressure, and then the second number, or the number on the bottom, is the diastolic. So if your blood pressure is 120/70, the systolic pressure is 120 millimeters of mercury, the diastolic would be 70. As the blood moves through blood vessels and get further away from the heart, the pressure does decrease just over time, and as the blood vessels spread out, as the blood spreads out over the different blood vessels, the pressure will go down. Your blood vessels are filled with certain receptors. There are stretch receptors that keep track of how much those arteries are stretching, known as baroreceptors. And then there are chemoreceptors that keep track of certain chemicals in the blood, primarily carbon dioxide. And those changes, either a higher or a lower level of stretch or a higher or lower level of carbon dioxide, will cause changes that are both neural and also potentially hormonal through the ADH and aldosterone hormones to change the blood pressure, to stabilize it and bring it more in homeostasis. This diagram gives an example of the feedback that occurs as blood pressure changes and moves outside of the set point necessary for homeostasis. So if we start here on the left, we see rising blood pressure, which will be picked up by the baroreceptors in the carotid arteries and also the aortic arch. They will send a message then to the brain that will cause two responses. First of all, the heart rate will decrease, so there will be a sympathetic nerve impulse sent to the heart to decrease the heart rate, but also the blood vessels will dilate, so they will get larger. That will lower the pressure overall, so that will cause a decreasing in blood pressure because the blood vessels are more expansive, and that will bring things then back to a more normal set point. If blood pressure has declined, going the other way, again, these baroreceptors are going to send a message to the brain, and this will in turn stimulate the heart to beat faster so that more blood is being pushed out into the blood vessels. And also the blood vessels themselves are constricted. There's vasoconstriction, bringing it a little bit tighter, which will in turn increase pressure. So we have this feedback loop to allow the blood pressure to stay within normal levels. This is the nervous system being shown here, which is a quick response. Of course, your hormonal system, where you're controlling the amount of water present in the blood for the blood volume, that's affected by how sodium is moving in or out of the blood vessels, and that will be determined by hormonal levels and is a longer, slower process. This diagram just shows how blood pressure changes as you move from the aorta here on the left of this graph to the vena cava coming back. So you see in the areas where fairly close to the heart, where we're staying pretty much in arteries, you can see we're hitting a few arterioles by the time we get to the end of this high pressure system, but you can see how the pressure fluctuates with each of that wave of blood that comes down through your arteries. And then as the blood moves into the capillaries and then eventually into the veins, the blood pressure is very, very low. So how do we get the blood back to the heart if the veins are very low pressure? Basically, there are three mechanisms that help move blood back. Because of the valves in the veins, as you contract your skeletal muscles, blood can be pushed up, like another step up the vein. So we see, the muscle here in a relaxed state with the foot's on the ground. Then as the heel is lifted, as we're walking around, it will constrict against or push against the veins and shove a little bit of blood higher, and then the valve will keep it from backflowing, and so then that blood can be pushed further up the leg with the next motion and further up again until it eventually gets closer to the heart. The second way that blood is aided in its return to the heart is just because of differences in pressure as we breathe. So as we breathe, we are expanding our chest cavity. It is of a lower pressure, and as a result, the blood is being drawn through that heart, kind of being sucked up the body to the heart. And then the veins themselves do have some smooth muscle tissue, not as much as arteries, but they do have some, and can constrict to kind of push the blood along the veins too, also sending it back to the heart. This especially kicks in as blood pressure is lowered as kind of a response, vasoconstriction again, to tighten that up, but that will also move the blood back towards the heart. I also want to mention that before birth, your circulation is a little bit different because the lungs, as they develop in utero, are non-functional. They're not doing a gas exchange, and so they just need enough blood for growth and development during that process. The blood from the mother, the maternal blood, then is the supply for oxygen and nutrients, and also then takes care of removing the wastes by moving them through the placental membrane and into the mother's circulatory system. So in order to facilitate this, before birth, you have two bypass blood vessels that are skipping parts of the normal circulation that you'll see after birth. And also there is a hole, the foramen ovale, between the right and left atria, which then allows actually the blood to mix. Sometimes this particular opening doesn't close after birth, and you hear about people who have a hole in their heart. Usually it will continue to shrink and becomes just sort of a minor inconvenience that needs to be monitored, but it's nothing serious, though in some cases surgery is required. So this diagram shows you basically you've got oxygen-rich blood coming down the ductus venosus into the baby's body, and then it enters this cord through the umbilical cord is going to enter the baby's circulatory system right around the liver through the inferior vena cava. This will enter the heart and go through the heart's chambers as normal, but you see that we have a shortcut from the pulmonary trunk right into the aorta. So skipping going to the lungs, there is still some blood that has to flow to the lungs so those lungs develop, but part of it is in a bypass sent directly to the aorta. Because of that, because this oxygen-rich blood is coming into the venous system, much of the blood that is flowing around the developing baby's body they're showing it as a purple color. It is not quite as oxygenated as the blood will be after birth, but it is sufficiently oxygenated to provide for the development of those tissues. So to check for understanding, can you name the different types of blood vessels and describe their key characteristics? Can you name and locate at least 2 major arteries and 2 major veins based on their regions or perhaps their special name? Can you explain the feedback loop, which helps maintain blood pressure at normal levels? And can you describe these 3 methods that the body uses to return venous blood to the heart?